Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dan Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the National Conservative Institute of Australia. And on this very wet and windy night in Brisbane, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jeff Kildea.
Thank you, Dan.
Who's the Honorary Professor in Irish Studies at the University of Sydney. Have I got that right?
University of New South Wales.
University of New South Wales, got that right. And we're here to discuss his new book on a not very well-known figure, but a very interesting one, Sister Liguori. And maybe it's worth you just sort of sketching the story, because essentially it's a nun on the run, but there's much more to it than that, right?
Yeah, well, that was certainly the way it was portrayed, and it fits into a genre of nuns on the run stories, and at this time, because this was in 1920, the story begins, and it's at the height of sectarianism in Australia, when Catholics and Protestants were bickering, fighting each other, and Sister Liguori was a nun at the Presentation Convent in Wagga Wagga, and on the night of the 24th of July 1920 she fled her convent, fearful that her Mother Superior was about to murder her. She then took refuge in the house of a Protestant family, who then passed her on to the Orange Order, and the Orange Order then gave her protection and sanctuary, and smuggled her out of Wagga Wagga, and then put her into hiding in with a Protestant family in Sydney. Now, the Bishop of Wagga Wagga, Joseph Dwyer, he didn't know where she was because of this. Now, of course, the Mother Superior wasn't about to murder her, but this was a delusion that she had formed, and so Dwyer obviously came to the conclusion that she was not of sound mind, and so he took out a warrant for her arrest under the Lunacy Act, and the police tracked her down and arrested her, and she was taken to the Lunacy Court in Darlinghurst, Sydney, and as a result of two psychiatrists interviewing her, they came to the conclusion that she was not insane, and they released her, or the Lunacy Court released her. Now that then led the Orange Order to fund a cause of action against Bishop Dwyer for having had her unlawfully or wrongly arrested, and that she sued the bishop in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. And so this became, as you can imagine, quite a big scandal that went all across Australia. People were dividing, Catholics and Protestants were debating the issue as to, on the one hand, the Protestants were saying she was an escaped nun, escaped from this terrible convent system. The Catholics, on the other hand, were arguing that she was a captured nun, and that the Protestants were prevailing upon her for her and keeping her a prisoner, basically, in order to attack the church and to attack the convents.
And I guess for context, for those that aren't familiar, this was a time when sectarian feeling in Australia was already very high. I mean, it always existed, and there have been various different incidents over the years, but why in particular 1921 was it? I think you described it probably as the peak of sectarianism in Australia. What I know, but there are obviously reasons for that.
Sectarianism had been part of Australian history from the time of the arrival of the First Fleet, and every now and again it would boil up, particularly at times when Catholics, say, were demanding state aid for their schools, which had been stopped from about the 1880s onwards, or when the Irish in Ireland were seeking their own self-government and things like home rule, and then later full independence. And whenever those issues came up, the Catholics, who were mostly Irish in these days, and the Protestants, who were mostly of British descent, those sorts of issues were chronic reasons for sectarianism. Now, in 1920 in particular, you start to get some incidents, such as in New South Wales in the 1920 elections of February, a Labor government was elected in which 40% of the cabinet and 60% of the caucus were Catholics. Now, for a people that are about 23% of the population, Protestants saw that as a grave threat, as you can imagine. At the time, Father Charles Jürger was a German-born Catholic priest who, during the war, had spoken out against conscription, and Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, didn't like that, of course, and he had him interned during the war, and then after the war, in 1920, sought to have him deported. Now that raised more Catholic versus Protestant issues.
So you had all this, you had the First World War, you had the Easter Uprising, you had conscription and the debates about conscription here, which were nuanced in various different ways and turned in different ways too. But by the end of it, the Catholics were strongly against, and certainly the second conscription referendum.
Yes, that's right.
But then you had 1920-21, well, 1919-21, you had the Irish War of Independence.
Exactly.
And so that's bound to stir up a fair amount of feeling amongst the Irish community here. And during that time, we get this little cause celebre that comes into the picture.
And as I mentioned before, Runaway nuns was a bit of a genre. Protestant, extreme Protestants would bring up every time a nun left the convent. They never sort of left convents. They jumped over the wall, or they escaped, or whatever. And so this was, our own. And mostly these occurred overseas, in England or Canada or the United States. But we had now had our own homegrown runaway nun, and so it had everything for the newspapers to headline.
The lawyers,
the lawyers got involved.
I mean, it was a range of complicated legal proceedings that this triggered, and we went through the business where the
lunacy court.
Lunacy was court, which ultimately was decided that
she was sane,
but then there was a subsequent action brought by.
She sued the bishop.
For
having had her wrongfully arrested.
Right, which she was not successful in.
No, she lost that case.
Yeah, so it was something for everyone, and the lawyers did well. Yeah. But ultimately, she was a pawn of sectarian disputes in Australia. And what's your view on her personally? What do you... And there's much more in this book, and please read it all. We're not really doing complete justice because there's lots of side tales and nuance. But her personal tale, was she mad in your view? Was she... she became estranged from her family somewhat, but then ultimately died with the Protestant family who had taken her in and died alone. I mean, with hardly the big community that probably would have supported her if she'd stayed in her tribe, as it were.
Well, what we've been discussing up to now has been sort of the background, the sort of religious and political history of it. But in the middle of it, of course, is a very personal story. It's a tragic story. There's a lot of farce goes on with, the things that were happening. But ultimately, it's a tragedy because here's a young woman. I mean, she was 29, but she had basically been enclosed in an enclosed convent since she was about 20, and so she wasn't worldly in any sense. She had felt that she'd lost her vocation. She used to teach children, and she loved that, but she was demoted and given domestic duties to perform at the convent, and she was not well physically, and so and she had certain mental issues which come out later. But so she was in a sort of a sad situation, and in a moment of panic, the reason she thought her Mother Superior was about to murder her was because she had gone away from the convent that afternoon and come back, and the doctor had suggested that she should need a rest, and she was then given a medicine which comprised castor oil, and those of us who've ever had castor oil know that that's not a very good taste, but the nuns used to then use black coffee to sort of hide the taste of the castor oil, and she thought this was poison.
Oh, goodness me.
So she thought she was about to be poisoned. as a punishment for her leaving the convent earlier in the day. So, you know, she's obviously got issues, but instead of the Protestant family to whom she had fled, then sort of, you know, reuniting her with the convent authorities, they thought that, you know, she needed to be rescued from the convent authorities, and they therefore smuggled her out of Wagga Wagga. But from then on, once the Orange Lodge got involved, and they were an anti-Catholic organisation which had been campaigning for years to close down the Catholic convents, they were pulling on one side, and then we had what's called, you know, the Catholic Federation, which was a Catholic political organisation, mainly trying to get state aid for Catholic schools. They're pulling on the other side, and you've got everybody pulling at her like a rag doll, children fighting over a rag doll, and she's sort of in the middle. Her brother comes from Hong Kong, where he'd been working. I mean, she was Irish and he was Irish, and he comes to try to persuade her to return to Ireland to the family. But she's determined to stay with her new Protestant friends. And it's, in one part, it's wonderful because they took her in, Reverend Tutchell and his wife, Laura. They didn't have children, and she became, in a sense, their daughter. And for the next 40-odd years, she sort of lives with that family. So clearly, she wanted to stay with them, but her brother was determined that she should come home. And he, in fact, kidnapped her off the streets of Cogra in Sydney. Now, you ask whether she was insane. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist. But what sort of in a twist of irony, I mean, having been found by the lunacy court not to be insane, in 1939, the Tutchells take her back to Darlinghurst Reception House because she'd been showing signs of serious mental illness. And the lunacy court at that stage, she was put into an insane asylum, as they were called in those days, at Parramatta. I think for 7 years.
Yeah, I think that to me that's the biggest lesson. It's this, and there's so much in this book, highly recommend it. A poor, some troubled individual who becomes used for very much at the centre of legal and political and religious conflict in the early 20th century of Australia. And I guess the sort of lasting relevance of this is that, you know, as we deal with our different sectarian religious disputes in Australia, with Gaza and Israel and the Palestinians and all the rest of it, and that it's there are lessons that one can think from learning from that particular history in the past and how it dealt with it. Yeah,
that's the importance of the story. It's a universal story. It's not a one-off. And the issues of sectarianism, as you say, are current today. We should learn how these things can get out of control, and individuals like Bridget Parker, Sister Liguori, can get hurt when big forces start pulling and pushing and using them as instruments for their own benefit.
Well, congratulations again on the book.
Thank you,
as someone of Irish heritage, I take quite an interest, and I look forward to you getting out and hearing more about it in your speech today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.